Okay, everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to this episode of the MirYam Institute webinar. We are focused on the ongoing operation inside the Gaza Strip by the Israel Defense Forces, a defensive operation, and I'm delighted to have with us two guests today. I'm going to introduce them in just a moment, but before I do, I want to express my profound thanks to Rosita Panini, co-founder of the MirYam Institute. Thank you, Rosita, for all you do. And to our colleague in common, Mr. Alan Langer. Alan, thank you very much for bringing about these briefings as swiftly as you do. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank all of you, as ever I do, for giving your time and your attention to a subject that certainly warrants your time and your attention. Before I bring on our first guest, Professor Freilich, let me tell you a little bit about him. Professor Chuck Freilich serves as an adjunct professor of political science at Columbia University, as well as at Tel Aviv University. He is a former deputy national security advisor in Israel and a longtime senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. And he has taught political science at Harvard, NYU, and Tel Aviv University. He is the author of Zion's Dilemmas, How Israel Makes National Security Policy, Israeli National Security, A New Strategy for an Era of Change, and Israel and the Cyber Threat, How the Startup Nation Became a Global Cyber Power. He has published numerous academic articles and over 170 op-eds, and he appears frequently on US, Israeli, and international TV and radio stations. He's also a publishing expert at the MirYam Institute. And I would encourage everybody to regularly visit his page at miryaminstitute.org under the commentary section to hear leading insight into the highest priorities of Israel's defense considerations and strategic considerations. And Chuck, sorry that it's on a day such as this, but we're very, very pleased indeed to have you with us. Thank you for giving of your time today. And we're going to try and talk for about 35 to 45 minutes. And I'm also going to try and interweave audience questions. So just another quick note to the audience, please put your questions in the chat box on your Zoom interface or in the Q&A section, or raise your hand virtually. And we will come to you to try and have you ask questions of both of our experts during the course of today's program. So with that, I am delighted to have you, Chuck. First of all, how are you doing over there in Israel?
I personally am doing well. I live just north of Tel Aviv, and I think we've had 3 days straight without an alert. So life is comparatively good. Unfortunately, people south of Tel Aviv, especially Ashdod and Ashkelon, do not have it as good. Life has been disrupted severely, and our hearts and minds go out to them.
Absolutely, and I'm pleased to hear things are calming in the center, but of course, as you've said, there are ongoing hostilities, very severe hostilities, and there's a lot to get through with you during this interview, and I'd like to go category by category, if I may. So I'd like to turn, first of all, to the Gaza Strip. Over the past few days, Chuck, I have spoken to a number of senior members of the Israel Defense Establishment. They are all, down to the last, very encouraged by the IDF's actions inside the Gaza Strip in response to the ongoing rocket fire. I, however, am not encouraged. I think that 2/3 of the country knows and has been shown to be within the range and trajectory of these rockets. Service at our airport has been disrupted. The rocket fire, meanwhile, continues. I'd like you to assess for us the effectiveness of the IDF's response to the rocket fire. And I'd also like to ask you afterwards to talk about what our allies and enemies are taking from current events. But let's do that latter part separately. For now, your assessment, please, on the IDF's response.
Assessments are always a function of one's expectations. We have been addressing the threat coming out of Gaza, primarily a rocket threat, the threat from Hezbollah, primarily a rocket threat, for over 3 decades now. And The sad news is that after 3 decades, we do not yet have the offensive capability to put an end to this threat. We can diminish it somewhat, emphasis on the somewhat. They can continue firing. So it's now day 11, they're still firing. I didn't see the numbers for today yet, but it was either yesterday or the day before that had the highest number since this began. In the previous rounds with Hamas, they have continued firing to the last minute, sometimes after the ceasefire went into effect. Hezbollah did the same thing in 2006. So overall, if you ask me, big picture strategically, has this been a great success? The answer is no. If you expected us to be able to defeat the rocket threat. If the objectives were different, which they were, which was not to defeat the threat, but to set back the capability so that we will hopefully have a longer period of calm before the next round, then this operation may have been more successful than some of the earlier ones. That, of course, we'll only know a few years from now, in retrospect. But I do think that the IDF clearly demonstrated much more effective capabilities to cause a lot of damage quickly. Their rocket producing capabilities were apparently set back considerably. What the IDF has informally nicknamed the Metro, the underground network of, amazingly enough, hundreds of miles of advanced tunnels, has been significantly set back. About 100 miles worth apparently have been destroyed. So in terms of the capability, it's been hit hard. But in terms of trying to change the overall situation so we don't have to face this again, that's not the case. And as a matter of fact, the government did not set that kind of objective. They, for example, did not set the objective of toppling Hamas. That there's been a lot of loose talk over the years, in this case, mostly from some of the right-wing politicians who have spoken about trying to topple Hamas and completely change the situation. And the fact is, Israel hasn't tried to do it under any of the governments for the last more than a decade, simply because that's the kind of situation where the cure is worse than the disease. If we wanted to topple Hamas and really bring about a fundamental change in the situation, we could do so at the cost of hundreds of guys. And that's not worth doing. Unfortunately, better to keep doing these periodic operations than trying to do that.
So Chuck, you've mentioned those voices that have called for a wide-ranging campaign in the Gaza Strip. I have to confess, and I actually remain adherent to that viewpoint, that I am one such advocate. For years, I've actually advocated for a far-reaching, protracted campaign in the Gaza Strip, inclusive of a ground incursion, in order to eliminate Palestinian Islamic Jihad and also Hamas. But looking at this particular operation, I'm actually now resigning myself to the view and the realization that the doctrinally enshrined strategic viewpoint regarding the Gaza Strip within Israel's defense establishment and the political echelons is that this conflict is almost to be unresolved in perpetuity, managed perennially. And I understand that, but the problem, it seems to me, with that mindset is that this threat is clearly becoming less and less manageable. Do you disagree with my viewpoint?
No. And in theory, of course, we would also all love to do what you're saying and go and topple Hamas and change the situation. The problem, aside from the human cost, and what would be a devastating cost to our international standing, which is happening anyway, would be that what happens after you topple Hamas? Who takes over? We don't know how to bring the PA back in after we've toppled Hamas. which means that the likely successor government is PIJ, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Let's say we topple them as well. Who's left? Some even more radical jihadis, the ISIS types? Is that the outcome that we want to bring about? I don't think so. So in what is a very bad situation, we've settled for a less bad outcome, which is to keep doing this. Some people make the argument, and I think there is validity to this, that the governments in office for the last decade plus, I'm referring to the Netanyahu government, have actually preferred to keep a weakened Hamas in power than to topple them, for the reason is that as long as they're there, and as long as the separation between the West Bank and Gaza is maintained, Israel doesn't have to conduct peace negotiations with the Palestinians because they can't deliver on a final agreement, even if they want to.
So the images coming out of Israel, what do they signal to Hezbollah? You've just made mention of the idea that we can manage this, that this is the lesser of two evils almost, but it perhaps augurs a worse, more dangerous situation down the line. And I'm coming back to the issue and the challenge from our northern flank, Hezbollah. So what do these images convey to Hezbollah? What do they signal to Iran? My view is that those two entities, which are basically one entity, must look at the disruption caused by Hamas, which, let's face it, Chuck, Hamas is our weakest enemy, but those others must foresee the potential for massive destruction and damage to be wrought upon Israel in the event of a two-front conflagration with Hezbollah joining or even leading the fray. What are your thoughts on that? And if before you respond to that, it was interesting that this week we saw a drone downed between Jordan and Israel by the IDF. Prime Minister Netanyahu said that, quote, Iran sent an armed drone to Israel from Iraq or Syria, and Iranian forces launched the armed drone, which our forces, that's the Israel Defense Forces, intercepted on the border. Tie all of that together for us, if you would.
Okay, so I mean, I share your conclusion, which is that our other enemies, Hamas as well, but Hezbollah and Iran, all draw some comfort from what they saw here. On the one hand, yes, they have clearly noted the remarkable capabilities that the IDF developed, because the intelligence here was really quite remarkable. Certainly when it comes to the tunneling system, the ability to launch precise and really crippling attacks on specific targets is impressive. But the overall inability to put an end to the rocket fire, not for the first time. This was the same situation in the three major rounds with Hamas in the past and with Hezbollah in 2006. And so it's not a one-time problem, it's clearly a fundamental problem. Now, Hamas, as you were indicating, is the weakest of our enemies, and the rocket threat that they pose is extraordinarily unpleasant as it is a joke compared to Hezbollah, which is about 150,000 rockets. Hamas started this with, I've seen different figures, somewhere between 15 and 30,000. And they're not nearly as good and effective a fighting organization as Hezbollah, but although they have gotten better. So clearly, from that point of view, this is a source of comfort for them. You have to ask yourself, though, why? Well, there have been a few rocket barrages, small barrages of maybe salvos is a better term. Palestinian organizations, not Hezbollah. They hide behind various names. Maybe it is Palestinian organizations. I doubt that they would have done it without Hezbollah's blessing. And there was the case of the drone that you mentioned, which is Iran. You have to ask, though, I mean, they've done all of that. And of course, they want to stick it to us a little bit. Why haven't they upped it even more, considering that Israel is already in, I believe, dire trouble in the United States over the limited confrontation with Hamas? Now imagine what would happen if there was a multi-front war. And if it comes to Hezbollah, we're going to have to respond big time, much more than here. I think Israel did succeed in achieving a great deal of deterrence against Hezbollah in the 2006 war. Now, some people in the audience will remember that the war ended in Israel. It ended in 2006 with a feeling in Israel that we had blown it, that we had made every mistake possible in the conduct of that war. And I still think that that was largely the case. But Lebanon was hit very, very hard. And the people of Lebanon, if I can speak for the amorphous mass of people, basically said to Hezbollah, enough is enough. We don't want to keep paying the price for your attacks against Israel. Don't do it again. Now, Israel has also done its best to strengthen and recharge that deterrent effect over the years. We've warned Lebanon. We've said publicly and not publicly, I imagine, that if and when the next round happens, Lebanon will be bombed back many, 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 many years, decades into the past. So I don't think they want to get into it. The other thing, and so far the proof is in the pudding. The other thing is you have to understand why Iran built up this truly mammoth Hezbollah rocket capability. It is basically their, let's call it their doomsday option, which they are keeping in reserve for the scenario that they are really afraid of, which is that Israel or maybe the US attack their nuclear program, and they want the capability to hit Israel really big time right from our border. They don't want to use it, maybe waste it from their point of view, for anything less than that.
So let me ask you another question. You've alluded to this already. As I've mentioned, you are a professor over at Columbia University. You're also a fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard University at the Kennedy School.
Was a fellow there.
There have been statements from numerous countries of support for Israel's operation, including from Austria, Slovenia, the Czech Republic, and Germany. The US, Chuck, did begin with statements of resolute support, but that's clearly changing. And we're also seeing horrendous statements coming out of various elected officials there in the United States Congress. Do you feel that this operation has implications for the US-Israel relationship writ large? And if so, why do you feel that?
I think it has severe implications. I think Israel isn't just being hurt hard by American media coverage, public discourse, which it was in the previous rounds. It's changed. I think we are being decimated this time. It is hard. Here and there you can find a supportive voice, but there aren't very many. And I saw a headline, I didn't get a chance to read the article yet, just before we started. Nicholas Kristof, one of the leading commentators in the New York Times, who already a few days ago came out with a vicious op-ed against Israel. Well, the headline this time was Israel may defeat or may be able to beat Hamas, but it's going to lose the US in the process. Well, we're not going to lose the United States that quickly, but we are in the process of losing it. At least the Democratic side and mostly the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. Now, I don't care about the partisan issue here. It's not a question of Democrats versus Republicans. The heart of the US-Israeli relationship was that it was bipartisan. So we need the support of both sides. And today there's a Democratic administration, next time a Republican, Democrat. We need both for the long haul. When public opinion is, at least on one side of the map, has turned so dramatically before this operation. In the last 3 years, there wasn't just a fluctuation or a minor decrease in support for Israel on the Democratic side, there was already a collapse in support. The levels of support for Israel and the Palestinians were almost even before this. And among young people, there may already be a slight majority in favor of the Palestinians. Well, young people are the ones who are going to be around as voters for the longer period of time. The Jewish community in the United States, as we know, has always voted 70+% for the Democratic side and more for the liberal wing of the Democratic side. The Jewish community is increasingly turning against Israel. I have read and heard with horror in recent years statements by various Jewish Americans, including some very prominent ones, expressing disaffection from Israel, alienation from Israel, distancing themselves from Israel. And I think I've already said here on at least one other occasion when speaking to the MirYam Institute, 73 years after Israel's rebirth and 76 years after the Holocaust, I have an impolite suggestion for what people who are that disaffected from Israel might consider doing. I have no problem with reasonable and reasoned criticism. Anybody who has read any of my readings and heard me speak knows that I am and have been very critical of our policies in a number of areas for many years now. But between being a loving critic and being so disaffected that you have to distance yourself, there's a big difference. We now have Senator Sanders and other wonderful people submitting proposals. We heard Senator Warren has already done this.
I know you say wonderful with more than a dose of irony and skepticism. Yes.
Senator Warren just about 2 weeks ago, Mr. Buttigieg during the campaign, calling, and Sanders today, calling to make military aid to Israel conditional on a change in its policy. Now, again, you can be as critical as you want. I share some of their criticism. We still have a country to defend when this conflict is over. First of all, against Hamas and against Hezbollah and against Iran, including the Iranian nuclear program. Do they really want to undermine Israel's ability to defend itself? I think this is morally indefensible and strategically misguided. Now, I have been planning this particular op-ed I did not get around to. I've written a number warning about a downturn in the relationship with the US, but one of the messages that I wanted to write for the Israeli public was that people here are convinced that when the current 10-year aid package ends in 2028, well, there'll be another one in 29. And I wasn't convinced that that was the case beforehand. What I am really worried about now is not 2029. I think for the first time since the early 1970s, before the Yom Kippur War, there's going to be a battle next year or this year for next year's annual allocation.
So, sorry, Chuck, did I just interrupt you? I think I share your concerns there completely. And we have about 10, maybe 12 minutes left with your segment before we bring on Colonel Yakubovich to talk more about the Palestinian arena. But in advance of me moving to my last double barrel question, if you like, I just want to encourage people who are on this call, please submit your questions. You can do so via the Q&A tab on the interface or via raising your hand or in the chat. We will unmute you, and priority goes to Ayla Palams. A number of those are on this call here today, or our student community, a number of whom I see here. Please do submit your questions because we'll all learn by way of them. I would like to ask you to do something that I don't often do. I've done it before. For our listeners, could you just position yourself on the political spectrum? There's a reason I'm asking you. I'll come to that in my second part. If you were to describe without naming or doing both, actually, where would you position yourself politically, Jack? And I'm reminding everyone, you speak like an American, sound like an American. You're here, in addition to your academic expertise, because you're a former Deputy National Security Advisor in the State of Israel. So with that, if you could just tell us that.
I define myself as a radical centrist. I don't believe in the terms left and right or dovish and hawkish. I don't think, or liberal and conservative. I think people tend to place themselves in pigeonholes which are too narrow. So that, for example, I was a strong supporter of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, I was actually the second former senior official in Israel to come out with a series of op-eds in favor of it. Not because I thought it was a great deal, it wasn't, but I thought it was the least of the bad options. And if and when we have exhausted all diplomatic options, and we have not yet done so, in my opinion, then I believe that the state of Israel will have no choice but to go the military route. So am I a dove, a hawk, a liberal, a conservative? I think that the number one challenge that the state of Israel faces is actually the West Bank Palestinian issue, how we maintain our character as a predominantly Jewish and vibrantly democratic state. And for that reason, I believe that we have to do our best to reach a two-state solution. I am not at all convinced that it is possible to do so, regardless of who's in office in Jerusalem. Does that make me someone on the left, on the right? I don't know. Some people, actually, I'm quite pleased that people mistakenly place me on the wrong side all the time. Some people think I'm on the left, some people think I'm on the right. That's actually exactly where I'd like to be.
So with that having been said, I want to ask about something that's very, very, I was going to say irksome, but irksome isn't the word. It's very alarming to me. I think it's extremely dangerous. And that is the perspectives that are put out by various Jewish organizations, ostensibly pro-Israel organizations. And that includes, for example, the organization J Street. I'm going to read a couple of their tweets that have been put out, at least one of which is by the head of that organization, Jeremy Ben-Ami. He said on a TV show, quote, "This occupation is now 54 years old. It's strategically terrible for the state of Israel, but it's also morally reprehensible and runs counter to not only democratic principles, but I would say to Jewish values." Elizabeth Warren just gave a tweet mentioning J Street in which she said, "In April, I told jstreet.org that the US cannot stand for security, human rights, and dignity while ignoring the suffering of Palestinians under Israeli occupation. Palestinians deserve to live in freedom and prosperity." Another tweet from J Street says, "Tell the Biden administration they need to be doing more to broker a ceasefire now." There's a lot of agitation coming from J Street at the moment. A lot of people say this is pro-Israel, pro-peace, represents the best of the left. What's your thought on that as an Israeli? Should an American organization be lobbying with policies that are antithetical to how the Israeli government sees things at this time?
On many issues, I happen to agree with J Street on the substance. Okay, like I said a minute ago, I thought the JCPOA was the best of the bad alternatives. I'm a strong supporter of a two-state solution, at least trying to reach one. I don't believe that it is the role of an American Jewish organization, an organization which defines itself as a pro-Israel lobby. I think you used the word ostensibly pro-Israel, and I would reemphasize that. I don't think it is their role to lobby the United States government against the policies of the democratically elected state of Israel. I say that even if, again, in many areas I agree with them. I say that even though in one area I'll maybe take their position and maybe they say this or take it a step further, which is I am deeply afraid that with our own hands, we are sealing the fate of the third temple of Israel's modern existence. And I'm talking about our policies on the Palestinian issue. The idea that we are continuing to settle, and it is a massive settlement program, which is totally antithetical to the ability to reach a two-state solution, is, to my way of thinking, mind-boggling. Now, once again, I don't think that it is the role of an American Jewish organization to lobby Washington about that. They can lobby Israel as much as they want, support organizations in Israel that think as they do. That I would encourage people to do. But not to lobby the administration against the US. It doesn't matter what your motivation is, and I will at least say that I believe that J Street and people like that their motivations are good. And I'm not saying that to be cynical, I mean it. I think the motivations are good. But again, we have a state to defend. Israel is not a one issue or two issue state. We have the Palestinian issue. We have Iran. Iran is Iran nuclear. It's Iran in Syria. It's Iran support for Hezbollah. It's Hamas. There are other national security issues, and we have a whole variety of domestic issues, which at the moment, by the way, I think are far more important than, as soon as the firing stops, than the national security issues. Our democracy is not in a good state at the moment. By the way, it would behoove Americans to talk with some modesty. The United States is not, or has not undergone the greatest period in the history of its democracy of late. I find what they do simply morally indefensible, even though I believe that they are trying to appeal to a higher moral God. It is mistaken. No matter how they position it, this is an organization that defines itself as being pro-Israel, which is lobbying the United States government against the state of Israel. Again, democratically elected government. It's unclear to me what great strategic planning and policy formulation capabilities J Street has, so that people arrogate to themselves the assumption that they know better than the entire national security apparatus of the state of Israel. Again, I very often agree with J Street. And people obviously have the right to their individual opinions, that goes without saying. But as an organization, where is this arrogance that they know better? I think there is, if I can say one last comment, Benjamin, there is an Israel lobby. It's called AIPAC. It has done a magnificent job over the decades. Part of its success was the fact that it was a single voice on behalf of the entire Jewish community. We should really go back to that. Unfortunately, it's not going to happen. But it is one leading voice. It's still the leading voice. There is an impression among people on the left in the US that AIPAC is a right-wing organization. It's very easy to say that without getting to know AIPAC up close. AIPAC represents the US-Israel relationship, and they seek to promote it regardless of who is in office in Jerusalem and in Washington. That's exactly what they should be doing. If and when the people of Israel, in pursuit of their democratic freedoms, elect a center or center-left government in Israel, AIPAC will support that government as well. I think it's time for a bit more unity, especially at a time when Israel's under attack. We can have the criticisms when the fighting settles down.
Thank you very much, Chuck. Just one quick audience question, and I'll ask you, it's quite a far-ranging question, but I do want to ask it. If we can do it briefly out of considerations for your time and our next guest, I'd be grateful. Jonathan asks, what overarching strategy should Israel adopt to avoid future conflict with Hamas?
I think, first of all, instead of trying to maintain the separation between the West Bank and Gaza, we should try and encourage reunification. Now, we can't do it, and if we're too upfront about it, it would actually be counterproductive, but we've done the opposite, which is to do our best to maintain the separation. I think we should support reconstruction efforts, but the reconstruction, to support that big time even, to create an interest on the part of the people in Gaza so that they have what to lose. But the reconstruction money should come either from the PA, via the PA, or let's say, for example, the Emirates and Bahrain. It shouldn't go directly to Hamas. We keep, time after time, we've turned them into our indirect negotiating partner. We've given them indirect economic support by agreeing to the Qatari support. It's time to change them and make the PA, as the lesser of the two evils here, the beneficiary of a change in our policy. And of course, try and work for a two-state solution. Not that I'm terribly optimistic about that happening, but until you try again, we don't know for sure.
Well, Chuck, just before you go, I want to, before I thank you more officially, I do want to come back on one point about J Street. You know, you and I, one of the things that I most enjoy about our relationship and our working relationship is our common readiness to agree and to agree to disagree. And as I've said publicly and as I've said privately, I continue to learn from you. I'd like to invite you back for a long form conversation about organizations such as J Street, perhaps as part of a panel. I can just share with you and I share with our audience that I actually, from my experience on the campuses check and also dealing with J Street and others similar to them, I actually don't believe that their motives are positive. I actually believe that they have pernicious motives towards the state of Israel. And I think, unfortunately, they actually covet much more proximity to power than they do a secure Jewish state or even a secure Jewish community. And I'd be willing to debate that, to discuss it and to talk about it. But I actually think it's very important that Israelis, I think it's high time that Israelis view askance the purported sincerity of the motivations underpinning organizations like J Street. I'll give you one example, Chuck, just to put my view forward on it. I remember when there was a move to oppose the JCPOA, J Street actually said that there shouldn't be work to block a nuclear Iran until the issue in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank is resolved. So they took an existential issue and said that that ought to play second fiddle to a political and very complicated political decision for the state of Israel and others. But as ever, I do enjoy speaking to you. Would you come back for such a conversation?
It would be my pleasure. I always enjoy both our public and private conversations, so any opportunity is a good one.
Thank you so much, Chuck, and enjoy the rest of your day if that's possible, and I look forward to having you back soon. Thank you so very much. Clearly, thank you so very much, Grisha. Thank you for being with us today. We very much appreciate it, and I'm going to actually introduce you, if I may, Grisha, for just a moment, if that's okay, so that everybody knows who we have the privilege of being in contact with today. Colonel Grisha Yakubovich, retired, concluded his military service, ladies and gentlemen, in 2016 as the head of the Civil Department for the Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, or COGAT. He currently serves as a policy and strategy consultant to various international NGOs. Colonel Yakubovich has more than 30 years of first-hand experience initiating and implementing high-level cooperation projects between Israelis and Palestinians in the public and private sectors. And we have about 30 minutes with you here today. May I call you Grisha, as ever I do privately? Can I call you Grisha here? Thank you very much. And
it's the same name that the Palestinians use. Why not? So why should it
there
be?
you go. And I'm very pleased to have you with us because we're going to dive a little bit more into the Palestinian aspect, the Palestinian Arab aspect of the ongoing conflict. And I'm going to reference in no small part a brilliant article that you wrote at MirYaminstitute.org. I'd actually encourage everybody to read that. It's entitled Hamas Wants to be Crowned Guardian of Jerusalem. Alan, during this conversation, if you could place a link in the chat box to that article from MirYaminstitute.org, that would be great. And I also want to draw the attention of the listeners to the fact that in the chat box, we've also placed a link to a video, a film that they can watch. It's called Withdrawal from Gaza. It's a very powerful documentary about the disengagement from the Gaza Strip that took place in 2005. Please copy and paste the link and watch it at your leisure, and also put it across your social media channels. It's very informative and it's instructive to the quandary we find ourselves in today. So with all of that having been said, Grisha, thank you. You wrote the following. You said, quote, "The current major escalation between Israel and Hamas is a result of the terror organization's long-term strategic vision aimed at ultimately crowning itself as Jerusalem's defender, both in the internal Palestinian arena and throughout the Middle East. The origins of the present round can be traced back to recent months when Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas floated a trial balloon in the form of elections to the Palestinian parliament." Now, Grisha, you're tracing all of the violence that we're currently seeing back to those events. Tell us why and how is it that lighting the touch paper in Jerusalem can have such direct and massive implications for the Gaza Strip and, of course, for the state of Israel?
Well, Benjamin, as you know, I shared this information with you in the past. I had huge discussions and let's say, sometimes some problems in the IDF when I spoke about what I think when it comes to Hamas. I think that they are. I have to flatter the enemies. Okay, they are my enemies. They tried to kill me a few times. I also try to do the same thing, of course, to defend myself. But they are masters of strategy. They are doing a great job, actually, and they are building themselves as a political Palestinian faction, preparing themselves for the day after. They believe that they have the legitimacy, and if they don't have it, they will take it or build it to lead Palestinians all over the world. Now we are talking about 12.5 million Palestinians. We are talking about not only about the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, 2.1 million, not only about the ones who live in the West Bank, 2.4 million. We are talking about the rest that live in refugee camps in Lebanon or in Beirut, in Syria, in Jordan, in Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, Argentina, the States, everywhere. So when they look, okay, when they see or foresee the future, they want to replace Fatah. That's their vision. So Mahmoud Abbas declared about elections in May. Now we knew, and Mahmoud Abbas knew, and Hamas knew that those elections will actually be canceled. Mahmoud Abbas knew that Israel will not allow the residents of East Jerusalem to participate in those elections. Hamas knew that also, but Hamas actually used this fact that Israel will not allow the residents of East Jerusalem to participate in the elections, and they will actually, as importunists, use it to empower themselves. So if Israel denies it, if Mahmoud Abbas is given up or he cannot deal with Israel, why don't they use it as an opportunity to be shown as the defenders of Jerusalem? And the only way to do it is to launch a rocket or few rockets. They expected a reaction from Israel. Of course, yes, they knew that Israel is going to react back. There will be some short round of escalation. They took it as a possible chance that it will start a larger round of escalation. I'm not saying that they were really surprised, because we can see that for the last 11 days, they are actually prepared. They continue fighting Israel. But it was, for me, as I look at it, from a long-term perspective, it was all planned.
So Grisha, in the same article, you actually stated, with regard to the launching of the rockets, to pull back the lens a little bit, that the move, that being the rocket firing, serves Hamas's interests on multiple levels. On the Palestinian street, as you've alluded to, it positions Hamas as the dominant party in the struggle for leadership. But much more interesting to me, for the purposes of this conversation, is what you feel this may do to Israel's new alliances or normalizations in the region. You've said, quote, "In the Arab world, what Hamas is doing pushes back against Arab states engaged in normalization with Israel by sending out the message to their publics that these countries are counterfeit defenders of Jerusalem, while Hamas is the genuine deal." Do you feel that this round of hostilities compromises the strengths of Israel's normalization deals? Wouldn't the shared sense of concern over Iran serve to maintain Israel's relationship with other signatories of the Abraham Accords, or do you think that that can all be undermined right here and right now?
What we face in this operation is actually the outcome of Operation Protective Edge in 2014. And I think that you and I had this discussion and we spoke about it, and I told you, and I do it in my lectures, and when I'm asking people who won in Protective Edge in 2014. So the answer is usually both sides or Israel. So a victory is in the eyes of the beholder. Hamas are convinced that they won in 2014. Now this victory is actually a victory that says what? We, Hamas, a small tiny organization, were able to stand against the strongest military in the Middle East for 52 days if we did it, you can do it also. We see the outcome of that victory in this operation. We see what is happening for the first time, by the way. This is the fourth operation, the long one, and this is the first operation that we see demonstrations on the border between Israel and Jordan. It never happened. We see the same thing from Syria. We see the same thing from Lebanon. We see rockets being launched from Lebanon for the first time. We see this drone coming from Iran. This is the outcome of 2014. This is the victory in the eyes of the beholder. It's a message also to other countries in the Middle East about future thoughts of normalization with Israel.
So I want to bring in some audience questions in just a moment, Grisha, but before I do, there are growing ramblings about a ceasefire. And you, I know, are not of the viewpoint that a ceasefire ought to be brokered, much less implemented at this stage. Tell us why you're so opposed to that idea.
Well, I think it's too early for a ceasefire, but unfortunately, the pressure from all over the world, and it's the first time I see something like that is happening. There's such a huge pressure from France, pressure from the United States, something that we never experienced. I think that Israel has still operationally some job to complete. What Hamas did from 2014 until today, and agreements that we reached with Hamas, and as you know, I've been there behind some of those understandings, negotiating with some parties. Hamas got a lot of money during the last 7 years. Now, the money was supposed to be given to not Hamas directly, and if I go back to the interview with Professor Chuck, we did a lot to reconstruct Gaza with the PA. Unfortunately, this process failed. And I have to mention that. Okay, this process failed with the PA because the PA actually were stopping any project, any development, any almost anything that we wanted to solve for the people of Gaza with the UN or with, I don't know, USAID or JICA, the Japanese, and they stopped it. So they became an obstacle for reconstruction. But Hamas used a lot of the donations and the money instead of supporting and helping the people, to treat the water crisis, the energy crisis, the sewage crisis, the economical crisis. They invested all the money to build their power. Those tunnels that we discussed, the long-range rockets, the new, I don't know, booby trap submarines, and all those new weapons. And what Israel operationally, the IDF did, is actually took all those operational advantages that Hamas developed and destroyed. And I hope that the majority of them were destroyed. I think that the IDF needs few more days to complete the job. And then actually when the ceasefire will be implemented, to create a catch to Hamas, that any money that will enter to Gaza, Hamas will have to prove that they are going to be given in a way, implementation of a project. We need to improve the mechanism of inspection inside Gaza the moment it will be agreed upon, but to make sure that they will not be able to use the money, the millions that they are going to get, to do the same thing that they did since 2014 until the beginning of this operation.
So let me ask another question then, Grisha. There are two soldiers. This is two among several others, but there are two soldiers whose remains are still in the Gaza Strip. I spoke about this yesterday, Oron Shaul and Hadar Goldin. Both of them were killed during Operation Protective Edge, the operation that you referenced early on in our conversation. In the context of a ceasefire, do you think that the return of those remains will be a feature of the negotiations and ultimately the brokering and implementation of a ceasefire? And do you think that they ought to be?
Yes, I think it should be a demand from Israel, but unfortunately, I know this is a square. I don't know. This is an issue that will not work, Benjamin. We need to understand that this is a different issue. It's two parallel issues that Israel tried to connect in the past. Helping the people of Gaza in implementing humanitarian project or aid, and as a result of that, to bring back the soldiers to bury them. Actually, there are four. It's two soldiers, two dead soldiers, and another two guys that were kidnapped, civilians. But Hamas will. This is my estimation. I hope I'm wrong, but I believe that Hamas will never agree to something like that unless it will be a deal, like we did with Gilad Shalit. They need to show an achievement that they release Palestinian prisoners. So for Hamas, it's two different dialogues, it's two different parallel lines that they will continue or discuss or negotiate with Israel through Egypt or through somebody else.
So you're saying that those two soldiers, the return of those two soldiers and their remains, that is a track to be pursued only with regard to prisoner, in fact, murderer release, and for rehabilitation efforts with regard to the Gaza Strip. The rehabilitating, incidentally, of infrastructure they cause the destruction of by way of their actions and by way of their terror, that would be entirely separate to the return of the two bodies. Now, let me ask you a question. Yahya Sinwar.
It was always separated, Benjamin.
Yes, but you said that Israel's trying to now bring about some...
Israel tried to...
Not succeeded.
Yeah, it failed. For the last 7 years, it failed.
Yeah. So Yahya Sinwar, can you tell us a little bit about that individual, please?
He's a terrorist. He spent a lot of many years in Israeli prison. It's not that he speaks Hebrew, okay? He understands us. I think one of my articles that I wrote for you was about Hamas's strategical negotiation, how they use the Israeli media for their purposes and things like that. And he's the guy that leads that. He's an expert in understanding us Israelis. He even understands us sometimes better than we understand ourselves. So he was weakened a little bit in the last round of elections. He almost lost the elections. That's why they had to do another something like another 3 or 2 rounds. So he will stay in power. But he's a smart guy, very close to Haniya and very close to Muhammad Dif.
But what's his? Tell our audience about his current role within Hamas, please, if you would.
In a way, Haniya replaced Khalid Mash'al as the head of Hamas, and he sits in Qatar, enjoys the 7-star hotels, and he's actually the leader. Let's say, in a way, the prime minister inside the Gaza Strip, the one that leads Hamas, the political wing and the military wing inside Gaza. So he's actually responsible to whatever is going on now inside Gaza. He's responsible on 2.1 million people. He's responsible on the rockets that Hamas launches, or he is responsible to the rockets that will launch to Jerusalem.
And that's about
the leader.
But what about Sinwar? Tell us about Sinwar.
No, I'm talking about Sinwar.
Right.
I'm talking about Sinwar. Haniya sits in Qatar now.
Correct.
Sinwar is the one that sits in Gaza.
Exactly.
Although he is not the deputy of Haniya, because the deputy of Haniya is Salah al-Aruri, and he sits in Lebanon. But Sinwar is actually the head of Hamas that is actually implementing the seat of the prime minister, but in Gaza, and he's in Gaza now.
Correct.
He's actually like a rat underground. He's hiding. Okay.
Right.
He will not dare to go out.
And that's what I want our audience to understand. But am I correct that he is somebody who was part of an exchange who was involved in the exchange of prisoners. Tell us about when he was released, because I just want our audience to be aware about the pitfalls of these exchanges. This is somebody who was who's now in Gaza, running the show in Gaza, of course, subordinate to Hanir, as you said. But tell us about the history of how this individual found his way to such a murderous role.
I think I said that he's a Hamas terrorist that was arrested by Israel, spent years in Israeli jail, and he was released with another more than 1,000 Hamas and Fij terrorists as a package deal to exchange prisoners with Gilad Shalit. So for him, he was exchanged as a prisoner for one soldier that was kidnapped. So you can understand that to release 2 Israeli soldiers that died in Gaza, I don't know what pieces they have from them, he will demand more than what actually in that deal that he was released.
I just wanted our audience to hear that from you, Grisha, because it's such a complex issue that an individual such as that who's now on the ground in the Gaza Strip. Can you hear me? Grisha, do you hear me?
Yes, but I cannot see you. I cannot see you.
Oh, well, you should be celebratory of that fact, Grisha. Many people prefer not to see me, but if I can be heard, I'm going to continue. It's just such a fraught issue that such an individual was released in order to bring back Gilad Shalit and is now on the ground and actively engaged in attempts to murder Israel's citizenry and to destroy Israel's civilian infrastructure and to terrorize the Israeli population. Let me ask you one last question before I come with some audience questions. Grisha, there's a lot of talk about moving the PA and Fatah back into the Gaza Strip at some point in the future. Surely such talk is utter nonsense. Do you have a view on that?
I don't know where you heard that. Mahmoud Abbas has been trying to reconciliate with his enemies, Hamas, for many years. Now, let's not forget a fact. Hamas won the elections in 2006. Actually, the last time that there were elections, in what some say Palestine, were actually in 2006. Mahmoud Abbas holds the chair so close and he will not release it, and there will be no elections in the Palestinian Authority until the day after Abbas. You probably can understand what do I mean by the day after. Hamas were disappointed in 2006 from what Abbas gave them, and in June 2007 they conquered the Gaza Strip from the unity government, from Fatah. They murdered 300 Fatah seniors, Fatah officials. They brought them to high-top buildings, they shot them in the knees, and they threw them down. Now, from that moment and on, we are dealing with 2 different Palestinian entities that hate each other. A Fatah entity in the West Bank, controlled by Mahmoud Abbas and Mohammed Shtaya, the prime minister, coordinated with Israel in the West Bank, creating actually an amazing reality in the West Bank for the people of the West Bank. Now, you can ask me, how do I know that, Benjamin? I have an office in Ramallah. I spend 3 days a week in Ramallah because, as you know, I'm a consultant to the biggest cement factory in Israel, and I sell cement to 300 factories in the West Bank. And the reality there, the economical reality there is amazing. Now, in Gaza, the ones who control and rule Gaza is a terror entity, Hamas. It's a terror entity. The people in Gaza, and I have clients in Gaza also, because I sent, and I'm sending, not now, I send cement to Gaza to my clients, and I have friends in Gaza, people that I know, people that respected me in the past. I really have friends in Gaza from my service in the IDF, and they are terrified from this terror organization, Hamas, that are actually controlling the Gaza Strip over another something like 47 to 49 other terror organizations. This is the reality in Gaza. So actually we are facing 2 different Palestinian, we can say entities, but we also can say states. So we are actually in a reality of a three-state solution. This is the reality for the last, actually from June 2007. And people are talking about the two-state solution. Okay, we may be able to reach to a two-state solution if there will be a reconciliation between Fatah and Hamas and Page and others, so they will agree upon one leader that will represent everybody and that would recognize Israel as a state.
So, Grisha, I just have time for a couple of quick questions. I'm going to ask one that was submitted by George, and George asks, how deep is the leadership of Hamas, and can that leadership be eliminated by way of targeted killings?
The answer is no. It's Hamas, it's a political party. It's also terror. They believe that the only way to free Palestine is by force, and the only way to throw us out from here is by force. And they are here, they will stay here, we are here, we will stay here, and we will need to find ways how to live together side by side, one against the other, but to eliminate them, it's impossible. It's really impossible.
Okay, and I'm going to ask Cade, who's an ILAP alumnus, to ask his question live, if I could. Alan, could you unmute Cade? And Cade, welcome to the program, and you have 15 seconds to ask your question of Colonel Yakubovich. Incidentally, Grisha, Cade may have heard you on the border with Gaza, I don't know, but when he was with us 2 years ago. But Cade, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Benjamin. And yes, it is good to see you again, Colonel. Thanks for your time in Israel. My question is related
before you ask your question, tell us about yourself so we know who's asking.
Yes, so I'm currently down in Florida in Jacksonville, a recent graduate of Wake Forest University School of Law, former naval officer. So that's my background. I'm also an adjunct at the MirYam Institute. But my question relates to kind of the PR battle that, you know, it is always a concern whenever Israel seems to do anything. But my thinking is there a way for Israel to come out of this conflict, either by initiating de-escalation or just, trying to move the needle themselves, where they can salvage both a PR win and, both a strategic win?
Thank you very much.
It's an excellent question. Unfortunately, in the PR battle, we lost. And we continue losing, and we are doing a bad job in that. There are many groups in Israel now, officers like me, retired ones, that are trying to change something and to do something. For example, I spoke today to the commander of Kogat, General Hassan Aliyan, and I gave 3 interviews in I-24, English, French, and Arabic, and I told him, Hassan, use us. We are officers. We are civilians now, and we can help Israel in doing better PR about, I don't know, strategic issues, about tactical issues, about everything. And I hope that Israel will improve what we say in Hebrew. I don't know, there's not another word, a different word to that. It's called hasbara, but I hate this word. And I think that the PR is the closest thing to what I think that Israel should do. So maybe we have amazing, beautiful bombs, and we have intelligence superiority, but we are doing a bad job in PR.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate that. I'm going to bring this session to a close at this point. Grisha, I very much appreciate you speaking to us today, as always. I'll be sure to get you a copy of this, and I hope that you'll put this out so that people can hear from you far and wide. I'd like to reiterate my profound thanks to Rosita Panini, co-founder of the Institute, to our colleague in common, Alan Langer, and to those who have dialed in and listened to this session today. Thank you, all of you, for being our guests today. Also, thank you to Professor Chuck Freilich prior to yourself, and to you, of course, Grisha. Thank you for continuing to educate us. Thank you for all that you're doing. And of course, we together pray for Shalom al Yisrael, peace over Israel, in the coming days, as soon as it is appropriate for that to return. Thank you very much indeed. And I look forward to the next time that we come together.
Thank you for having me.